Good morning. Good morning. How are y'all doing today? Hannah, good morning. Full of surprises. Good morning, Caitlin. Tiffany, how's everything going with you? Hi, good morning, Monica. Minnesota, good morning. Hello, Cody, excuse me. Let's see here. Glad to hear it. Yeah, it can get real messy real quick, can't it? I guess you overcame it, though. That's good. Okay, Caitlin's here. Where are you, Caitlin? There you are. Haley, good morning, Haley. Good morning, Teresa. Is that in your tummy as opposed to somebody else's? Oh, Tiffany. Yeah. Is that your tummy? Oh. Good morning, Riley. Good morning, Rhonda. Is he pretty stable now, Tiffany? Good morning there. Good morning, Teresa. Excuse me. Good morning, Rhonda. Victoria. Good morning to you. Wow. Mm. Mm. Good morning, Ramsey. All right, let's see here. Interesting. I think all of you got that Word document that I sent you, about 6 or 7 pages long, starting with chapter 12. So let's see if we can finish that up this morning. So let's see, what was the last thing we talked about, Teresa? I think we got into the brain to some degree. The cerebrum and its components. Good morning, Mallory. So what was the last thing that we talked about last week? What part of the brain did we stop with? Cerebral aqueduct. Okay. So maybe we were on about page 437. Hello, Brandy. Page 445. Okay, page 445. Okay. So looking on page 445, looking at figure 1219, you got a nice color version there. You can see the cerebrum, and you can, what they're doing with the sort of blue-green color there is they're showing you the shapes of those ventricles. You remember how we talked about ventricles? Most people think about the heart. Nothing wrong with that. But that's just a cavity. And so as you look at that blue-green structure, the unusual structure, you see up in the left-hand corner, the lateral ventricles. Don't worry about the horns. You've got a lateral ventricle here in this cerebrum, a lateral ventricle in this cerebral hemisphere, cerebral hemisphere. And if you notice, I think we probably mentioned this, come down the middle between those two pictures and you see lateral ventricles, that's right and left, and then you see the interventricular foramen. So the cerebrospinal fluid that is made in those ventricles and flows out of those ventricles goes through the interventricular foramen into that little thing. Looks like a bird head, doesn't it? Looks like a little eye, and then you got a tiny little beak down there. And so that's the third ventricle. So you have the walls, let my hands be the walls of the thalamus, and you see that little tan dot in there, that kind of light brown. That's a joining of the left and the right sides of the thalamus. They have a name for it, but you don't have to worry about it. So there's your third ventricle, and then you come down, you see that little skinny neck, and that little skinny neck is the beginning of the cerebral aqueduct. Goes through the midbrain, remember? And it goes right on down to through the pons, and then you see it says fourth ventricle as you come down in the middle. Remember now, cerebrospinal fluid is being produced in all of those ventricles. And the ependymal cells, remember those guys back in chapter 11? They've got the cilia, and they're pushing along, just like they push mucus out of our respiratory tract. They're pushing cerebrospinal fluid. Now you come down to the fourth ventricle, and you see that the fourth ventricle between the cerebellum and the medulla, and then it goes on down to the central canal of the spinal cord. Comes out the bottom of the cord there, down around L2. Now, what you don't see here is, let's see if they say it up here. They mentioned the cerebrospinal fluid in the second column, the choroid plexuses. Now, what you don't see in the fourth ventricle is there are three openings. Three openings. Now, we're not going to give you all those names. They all have fancy names. But look over on page 446. Page 446. And look at figure 1220. So here's a sagittal view. They cut the brain in half. Now let's look at the picture for just a minute up top. And you see to the left of the picture, up there around the cerebrum, you see it says choroid plexuses of the lateral and third ventricles. Each ventricle has a network of capillaries. The choroid plexus is a network of capillaries. It's got blood in it. And out of that comes cerebrospinal fluid. Now follow the arrows. Not that big orange arrow, don't worry about that. That's an opening there. There's the interventricular foramen, but you see the black arrows coming down? And follow them into the cerebral aqueduct and into the fourth ventricle. And as it goes down toward the central canal, you see that little guy go off to the right? See that little arrow go off to the right? Well, there are actually three openings, as I told you. And those openings allow the cerebrospinal fluid to go out into the subarachnoid space. And remember, the subarachnoid space is all around the brain. Remember your layers. Dura's on the outside, arachnoid, and then you have pia mater. And between the pia mater and the arachnoid, there's a space they call the subarachnoid space. And it's there our brain floats in the fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. So you follow the arrows. You see where that arrow goes off to the right, out of the fourth ventricle before it gets to the central canal. And you see the black arrow go down around the spinal cord. Our spinal cord floats in cerebrospinal fluid. Follow that arrow that goes up, curves to the left around the cerebellum. And then you look up on the top and you see these black arrows also around the cerebrum. And you see these little projections. Now, if you look over to the right, see where those little arrows go into this little projection? And the projection is called an arachnoid granulation. Now, some people might call it an arachnoid villi or villus for singular. You think of the villi in your microvilli in your GI tract, small intestine. But those are little projections where cerebrospinal fluid goes out. It exits. It exits from the subarachnoid space. But we're always producing new cerebrospinal fluid, so the fluid is always at a homeostatic level, just like glucose and temperature. This is another homeostatic mechanism that our body takes care of. We don't have to think about it. But you see where the granulation goes. As you see the black arrow go into the granulation, I want you to see that sort of a dark blue. I don't know, you ladies would know what color to call that blue, but it's got a little bit of blue and gray in it. I want you to follow that opening, that tubular opening over to the left, and you see it is called the superior sagittal sinus. So those little granulations, and they give you an enlarged version to see over on the right-hand side of that picture. You see it looks like a little bush coming out of there. See that kind of golden, yellow, orange arrow comes down. It shows the blood and the dural sinus. Now, cerebrospinal fluid came from blood. It's not blood because there are no red blood cells in it. If you got red blood cells in it, you got a problem. And so that cerebrospinal fluid leaves the subarachnoid space and goes into the superior sagittal sinus. Now look back on page 444. Take your book and go back to page 444, figure 1218. Now, I want you to, again, look at the bottom picture. C, cranial meninges, frontal section. Hi, Alexis. Now, look over on the right of that picture, the right side, and you see pia mater. This is down at the bottom of those terms, pia mater, subarachnoid space. Now, look at the subarachnoid space. Got all those tiny little trabeculae. You've heard of that term before, right? And so that fluid's flowing in there, and then see right there where that superior sagittal sinus is, it looks like an upside down triangle. You see the arachnoid granulation. And that's where the cerebrospinal fluid goes into the subdural sinus, the superior sagittal sinus, through which blood flows. After blood has come up to our brain, oxygenated the cells, it gets channeled into the superior sagittal sinus. And that blood is going to eventually work its way back. We're not going to get into all that. You'll get in this when you get in the circulatory system, then you'll have an understanding of that. But just to understand, it takes blood back down from the brain and brings it back into the heart. So it can get pumped to the lungs, and then the blood coming from your liver, where you picked up all your protein and your amino acids and your lipids and your carbohydrates. It's all getting renourished, refilled, so to speak. Just a circle. Okay? Blood goes up, gets collected, comes back down. Blood goes up, gets collected, comes back down. So that's how it works with the cerebrospinal fluid made by the choroid plexus in each ventricle, gets out into the subarachnoid space so that our brain floats in fluid, means of protection, taking up shocks. Okay? Anything that disturbs the movement of that fluid, hinders it, or allows it to leak out, we have a problem. Homeostasis is being disrupted. Okay? Too much fluid, you're going to get a lot of pressure on the brain. Not enough fluid, you're going to have the brain moving in there and can get bruised. So you want to know that flow of cerebrospinal fluid. So, having said that, and you can look on page 446, they'll mention the ependymal cells. Those are the ones that help circulate the fluid. So make sure you read that on page 446. They've got 4 steps there. So let's go to page 448. Page 448, and we're looking at the bottom of the first column, and you see it says the spinal cord. Now at the top of the second column, they have a couple of bold print terms, sections within that column, and you see relay station and processing station deals with the function of the spinal cord. So make sure you read that. It's not difficult. Just pull it out, make yourself a little note. Here's what it is in a relay station and so forth. And then come down to the section where it says protection of the spinal cord. And you have the same membranes. We're not going to go there, Ramsey. We're not going to go there. And so you've got the spinal meninges, like we said, the cranial meninges and the spinal meninges. They are one and the same. They are one and the same. So we have protection for our spinal cord and our brain with bones, and also with those membranes and the fluid through which that membrane, and the fluid that flows through those membranes. On page 449, there is next to a picture 1222, a cross section of the spinal cord. What I want you to do is read that box to the right. Talks about epidural anesthesia. Some of you ladies who've got children, you may have had an injection there, helped you with your labor. And then it also mentions lumbar punctures. We would call them spinal taps sometimes. And you come over to page 450. Page 450, and we're looking at figure 1223. So on 450, in that first column, you see external spinal cord anatomy. Now, there's a couple of terms in that short little paragraph that I want you to be familiar with. As you come down about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines, somewhere around 7 lines, you see the term conus medullaris. Conus medullaris. And that is the end of the solid cord. And you see there it says at the level of the first and second lumbar vertebra, the spinal pia gathers into a very thin structure known as the filum terminale. You can relate this to the picture below. You'll see them say filum terminale down there in the middle of the sacrum and the coccyx. Over in the right column, you see the bold print term spinal nerves. About 4 or 5 lines down. And you want to read through that and come to the end of that little section, and you see the word cauda equina. Cauda, caudal means toward the inferior, toward the back of your bottom. And then equina, horse. Horse's tail. So we don't have a solid cord from about L1 or 2 down into the sacral area of the vertebral column. So you have individual nerves that come down. So you want to know about the conus medullaris, what it is, the filum terminale, spinal nerves, and you see cauda equina. Thanks, Mallory. Now let's look over on page 451. Page 451, and you see the heading there says internal spinal cord anatomy. So we're looking within the cord. And you see up at the top those bold print terms, central canal, gray commissure. You want to know those, what they are. And you come down to the spinal gray matter. Now you're looking at the cross section in figure 1224. And so when you see spinal gray matter, remember that would be unmyelinated matter, unmyelinated axons. Then you come down to 3 parts of the spinal cord. Those 3 parts, the anterior horn, posterior horn, and lateral horn, they're all listed down in this cross section and looks somewhat like, people say it looks like a butterfly. And it kind of does, doesn't it? So when you look at the posterior horn and you read up here in the commentary on it, you see it says it contains the cell bodies of neurons that are involved in processing both somatic and visceral incoming sensory information. So that section of the gray matter is sensory in function. When you look over to the right, and you see it says posterior root sensory, okay? That's got afferent neurons in it, picking up sensations, posterior root ganglion. And then you see the blue lines go out as a spinal nerve to some sort of receptor. In the case of the blood vessels, over there to the right, you see visceral sensory. They're monitoring the blood pressure. You see in the skin, they're monitoring Merkel's discs and those lamellated corpuscles and so forth that pick up sensations from the environment. And so those action potentials that are produced come from the skin, come from the blood vessels into the posterior root ganglion and into the posterior horn, which is sensory. Now from there, it's going to go up to a control mechanism in the brain. So you can see it's a pathway from our sensory receptors, whatever they might be, on our skin, various parts of our organs. They come into that posterior root ganglion. They go into the posterior root, and they don't show you anything at this point, but they go up to a control center like the hypothalamus. Now we've got two other horns that you need to know about. You look to the left of that spinal cord illustration, and you see lateral horn, and you see, come down to the bottom, you see anterior horn. Now they didn't draw it on the left, but you look over to the right, you see those red lines coming out. Those are motor neurons. So the lateral horn and the anterior horn, or you can call it the ventral horn, they're dealing with motor neurons. That means messages will go out of the spinal cord to some effector. And as you look over to the right, you see the visceral motor smooth muscle. So from the lateral horn comes, we would call it autonomic. Some people would say automatic. It happens, you don't have to think about it. And that nerve is a motor neuron, goes to the lungs. You look from the anterior horn, you see another motor neuron going out on that root, from that root, that anterior root. And then that goes to muscles that we can consciously control. It's all put together beautifully, isn't it? It works real well. That's why you have turned on your computer today, and I'm sitting here at my breakfast dining room table talking to you, sharing this wonder that we live in. So you see that the anterior root connects to the anterior horn and the lateral horn. Posterior root connects to the posterior horn. Posterior, sensory, anterior, motor. So when we think of spinal nerves, notice where come over to the right, after you see those two roots join, we have what is called a spinal nerve. You got 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off the vertebral column, through that column, coming off the spinal cord. So every spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. It's mixed, got sensory and motor in it. Now, keeping in mind that all that we've been talking about is gray matter, right? Looks like a butterfly. And you've got all this, we would call it white matter, around the butterfly. Look to your right, up in the second column, and you see spinal white matter, ascending and descending tracts. Now remember, tracts are groups of myelinated neurons. And as you come down, I want you to read that paragraph. You're going to see an unusual word that we don't use very often. You see the posterior funiculus and lateral funiculus and the anterior funiculus. Those are groups of myelinated neurons. And you notice up there at the title, it says ascending, which means they would come from the spinal cord up to the brain. The descending tracts would come from the brain down to the spinal cord. And there they would connect at various levels in our vertebral column and the spinal cord, which is surrounded by the vertebral column. They would connect with neurons, as you see here, so that motor functions are carried out if they come down from the cortex to the spinal cord. If they go up to the cortex, that's a sensory tract, brings in information about the environment, whether it's your GI tract or your heart or whatever. So make sure you read that, and don't worry about the columns. It gets real busy there. I do want you to notice this, though. This makes it kind of easy whenever you get into hearing some terms about tracts. Look on page 452. And up at the top in those two columns, you see two sections, says ascending tracts and descending tracts. Ascending tracts is in the first column, descending tracts in the second column on page 452. Now, we're not going to go memorize all that stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there. But I want you to think on one thing. I want you to understand one thing. Look at the box down below in figure 1225. Don't go worry about all those different colors on that cross section. We're not going to deal with all of that. Don't spend a lot of time on it. You can look at it, but I'm not going to ask you anything about it. We got enough to do as it is. Ascending tracts, you know, they come up to the brain. Now notice the 1, 2, 3rd ascending tract. Look how it's named. Ascending tract. Now, look at its name. Spinocerebellar. What that tells you is it originates in the spinal cord and ends in the cerebellum. Nice way to name things, isn't it? That would be a sensory ascending tract. And guess what? In terms of the motor tracts, they have some names that tell you where it starts and ends. Look at the first one under descending tracts. Cortico, that's the cortex, spinal tract, ends in the spine. So if you ever have to get into those tracts, which we're not going to do, have that sort of foundation. The name is going to tell you where it starts and where it ends. And when you recognize some of the terms or the sections of the spinal cord, and you know some of the sections up there of the brain, you can say, okay, that's a motor tract, that's a spinal sensory tract. So the name will tell you. It's kind of like the, say, I-20 to Atlanta. Some people could say, let's get on the Florence Atlanta highway. That's what we would say. People who live in Atlanta would say, let's get on the Atlanta to Florence highway. Of course, it's a interstate. We know that, I-20, but you get the point. And that's the way people sometimes described routes, highways, roads from one place to another. Get on the Florence to Atlanta highway, and you'll get there. Get on the Atlanta to the Florence highway, you'll get there to Florence. Okay? So that's all I want you to know about that. Now we're going to scoot all the way over. Number of pages over here. Actually, we have finished that chapter now, and so we're into chapter 13. We're into chapter 13, and that starts on page 477. So hop over to page 477, entitled chapter 13, the Peripheral Nervous System. Now go back in your mind. And when we first started looking at the nervous system, we talked about two divisions, didn't we? The central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And then they had their divisions. Go back and review that. Get it cemented up here, and it's going to make more sense to you, as we talk about these things. So as you look on page 477, come all the way to the bottom. Last two lines on the page. The peripheral nervous system links the CNS, central nervous system, to the body and to the external environment. The PNS does this by first detecting sensory stimuli. Go over to 478. And those stimuli will be sent to the CNS, as you see up there at the top, sensory input. The CNS produces or processes the input and then transmits the impulses through the PNS to effectors, which are either muscles or glands. And that's a response. So whether you go outside and it starts raining, and of course you can see the raindrops falling, you can feel them, all that is sensory stimuli that our body picks up, and we either go indoors, we put on a raincoat, we open an umbrella, something like that, we have a response. So all that information comes in through the peripheral nervous system, goes to your brain, which is central, processed. You start thinking, oh no, I left the umbrella at home, but I do have my raincoat in back with a hood on it. And so you get it and put it on. That is the peripheral nervous system carrying out to the muscles. And so you cover yourself to keep yourself somewhat dry. Have a couple of pictures on page 478, figure 13.1. And you see you have on the left the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, brings messages into the central nervous system. They're processed there. You know, we think about the occipital area according to that with the eye, and there's what we see. But then we have association areas where we have memory stored, and we draw from that memory. Okay, I'm looking at a coyote instead of a dog. That is not a dog. So you make distinctions like that. You've learned to do that over a number of years. You process it, and then you start to make a response with motor. You look over to the right, you see there's a red line going out to the skeletal muscles, and you say, I need to get inside the car or the house or whatever. That's a wild animal. If a wild animal approaches you, that wild animal's got a problem, probably rabies. Could very well be rabies. But you've got people who really just don't realize what they're doing when they say, oh, let's see all the raccoons, and they put out this food. Next thing you know, that raccoon's brought his cousins along. Now you got a dozen raccoons in the back. Then they call the Department of Natural Resources and come help me. Well, they created a problem. You got to leave those wild animals alone. That's just a little safety point there. Okay, so let's go to on the second column, sensory division. You can read that. You'll see it will divide into a somatic sensory division and a visceral. You can read that. Nothing heavy about it. It's just what you got to know. Visceral, obviously, is going to deal with your GI tract, your bladder, so forth. kidneys. And then you over here on page 479, you got the motor division. And the motor has a somatic motor division. That's our muscles and our glands, okay? Our muscles. And then you see, you come on down to the visceral motor division, which I think we mentioned a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. People call it the automatic, and it does work and respond automatically. We don't have to think about it. It's involuntary. We don't have to think about that. It's going to keep homeostasis in the body. And they call it the autonomic nervous system because it acts independently of our central nervous system in the sense of the responses that we have. So as you read through that paragraph, you'll see the terms sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. You'll find, and you probably already know this to some degree, but the sympathetic nervous system is often called the fight or flight system. It's there to get you out of danger, help you respond quickly to a situation. Sometimes people do some amazing things. My father and I were, when I was a cadet at the Citadel, he asked if I could get off one weekend, and he wanted me to come down and play some golf with him at one of those places like Beaufort or something or another. And so we were down there playing, and my mother would happen to be with us, and we had hit a ball into a creek. Well, the creek had about a 3 or 4 foot drop in the sense from the ground down to the creek. So we were looking for the ball down there, and all of a sudden we heard this huge hiss. And both of us leapt, jumped up about 3.5 feet, and were over on the bank in a split second. We knew that was a gator, and we were getting in the area where we were not wanted. That was the sympathetic nervous system. It gives you amazing strength at sometimes. And so my mother said that she thought it was really funny because she was across the golf course, and all of a sudden, pew, her husband, my father, and I were on the ground in a heartbeat. That's what your sympathetic nervous system does for you. Helps you handle some sort of a problem. So they call it the fight or flight. You come down to the last 4 lines of that column, and you see it says, the parasympathetic nervous system is described as the rest and digest system. We've been doing that for the last, 6-8 hours? Had a little supper last night, got prone, went to sleep. Parasympathetic nervous system was taken over there, helping with digestion and so forth. So in a sense, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic are opposed to each other. Not really. They're just monitoring the systems for homeostasis. Some people say they're antagonistic. That's not wrong. They don't argue over things, but they keep it balanced. They keep the internal environment balanced. Okay, so you're going to read that. Now on page 479, second column. Now we have already covered, as you see there, it talks about peripheral nerves and associated ganglia. But I want you to come down to the 2 bullets that you see, spinal nerves. You already know quite a bit about those. We just went over them. And of course, you'll study it for a couple of days, and then you'll get it down. And then you got cranial nerves. So we have 31 spinal nerves, pairs of spinal nerves, and we have 12 cranial nerves. Come from the brain. Now, if you would look on page 480, and you see at the bottom, functional view of the peripheral nervous system. Now, we've basically talked about that. Picks up information in the environment, in your body's environment, and sends it to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system sends it out through the motor part. So you can read through that, but it's basically going to say the same thing there. On page 481, You look at the bottom where it says the cranial nerves. And you see a list of those cranial nerves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So you want to know the number, the name, and one function. One function. You can pick that function. There's several functions. But for instance, when you look at number 3 down at the bottom of page 481, you see it says the oculomotor. Number 3, that's your third cranial nerve. Now, if you take, sometimes you can take the name and you can figure out what it's going to do. Oculo, motor. It's not going to help you see. It's going to help you move your eyes so that you can see something off to the side. So being a motor nerve, it's going to connect to muscles that will move your eye left and right, up and down. So sometimes you can figure the function out by the way it's named. Okay, so you know about the cranial nerves now. You want to know the number. You want to know the function of one function of each cranial nerve. And we're going to jump over, skip all this stuff here. We're going to go over to page 491. Page 491, you come down that first column where it says structure of spinal nerves, and notice the next term, spinal nerve plexuses. Come down 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. Don't worry about the other 3. Just come to the 4th, and it restates what I just said, the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And you can see they divide them up into 8 cervical, 12 pairs of thoracic, and so forth, 5 of lumbar. But you come down to that bold print term, and you see it, nerve plexuses, and it gives you a definition. So it's the structure in which spinal nerves come together and merge to form complicated-looking networks. There's actually cross connections in there. It's pretty neat stuff. But that's all you need to know. If you want to go dig into it, that's fine, but I'm not going to test you on all of the different kinds of plexuses. If you look at the next sentence after nerve plexuses, it says the axons of each spinal nerve cross over one another to enter different plexus branches. So it's not like one nerve comes out and goes over to here. You've got several that can actually join, and some will do the back of your arm, some will do the side, some will do the front, some will do this part of your hand, some will do this part of your hand. And so what we have learned from that is, if you will look over on page, let's see, where did I see that? Let's scoot over to, well, look on page 492. You don't have to know this. I'm not going to put it on a test for you, but just look at the plexus on 492. And you can see how C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, and so forth come out. But sometimes these nerves cross with each other and connect with each other for a purpose, not just by chance. It's for a purpose. I want you to go to page 497. And as you look at figure 13.9, 13.9. Sometimes I look at that and I'm still amazed at it. Whatever job you get into, I hope you get a good one where you can be amazed at what happens and how you can help someone. And wow, fascinating. On that chart, come down where you see nerve and go all the way about halfway down, and you see the word sciatic nerve. One of the longest nerve in our body. Don't worry about what it innervates and all that. It's a big nerve, but you've heard of people, they say, I have sciatica. Yep. That's the nerve that sometimes gets bothered. Disc gets blown, pushes some pressure. Anyway, just want to know that sciatic nerve, the longest nerve in your body. I want you to turn all the way over to 504. Page 504. Now, as you look on page 504, you see a person, an illustration of a person, and you see all these divisions. You look on the left side, that's the front of the person's body, and what they're showing you, just as they are on the dorsal surface of the body, is what nerve innervates what part of your body. And those sections that are innervated by spinal nerves are called dermatomes. Look at the second column, and you'll see the bold print term, dermatomes. So when somebody comes in with a problem in some aspect of their musculoskeletal structures, they may have numbness, they may lose motor control or something like that. They can trace it back to a particular nerve. Now, this is barring that you have a stroke or whatever, but say some damage in the vertebral column where you have a bulging disc, or maybe you have a disc that is deteriorating and the vertebra is starting to press it toward each other. They're not separated like they should be. And so pressure can be applied to a nerve, and then these various signs and symptoms show up. Loss of function. So they know where the damage is because they know the map here. So you want to know what dermatomes are. And you can see how you read through that little section, those two paragraphs, and you can see the usefulness in knowing that. And then the second paragraph is going to talk about referred pain. You want to know what that is? Probably the one that is the most famous is when somebody is having a heart problem, heart attack. Their jaw may hurt. They may get pain down their arm, the left arm. So that's what they call referred pain. So you read about that, and it'll tie some things together for your understanding about why people get that sort of pain when they have actually no problem with the arm, but the problem's in an organ, some type of viscera. Now let's look at closing out here, chapter 13. Look on page 508. On page 508, you look up at the top and it talks about reflex arcs, integration of sensory and motor function. So you come down to the bottom of the column, and it gives you a little example. All of us have had various examples where we had an automatic response. And you see the last three lines. Programmed automatic responses to stimuli. Programmed automatic responses to stimuli. Those are reflexes. We really don't think about it. It just happens. You look at the top of the next column and you see the circuit of what we call a reflex arc. So you have a sensory division, that's your receptor. You have the central nervous system, but it doesn't have to be thought of, okay? It can be down in the spinal cord. You don't even think about doing what you're going to do. And then motor, where your muscles or glands respond. Some bug can fly towards your eye, and immediately you just close your eyes and turn your head. It's okay if it hits your head. Don't want it to get in your eye. But you didn't sit there and look at it. Oh, I am going to be hit by a bug. I will close my eyes and turn my head. You don't do that, do you? No, you just instantaneously. And that's usually there, that reflex is there to protect us. That's kind of what happened in the creek bed down there in Beaufort with my father. Didn't think twice. We just went out of there in a heartbeat. Didn't think about what we're going to do. We just did it. All right, that takes care of chapter 13. So now what we want to do is look at a few things in chapter 14. Chapter 14 is on page 518. And so you see it says we're the autonomic nervous system and homeostasis. And of course, as I said, they sort of balance each other out, keeping the internal environment stable. So you can read the first two paragraphs on page 518. It's basically going to say what you already know, but it may solidify it and strengthen it. And you look on page 519. Functions of the ANS and visceral reflex arcs. Just read the first paragraph. That's 6 or 8 lines there. We've already discussed it basically. You know what a reflex arc is, so it just happens to be in this particular system. And you look over on the right-hand side, you come down to the bottom where it says comparison of the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Now remember, the somatic nervous system deals with muscles and skin, okay? Autonomic nervous system deals with viscera, smooth muscle, visceral muscle, and glands. Now notice in the picture at the bottom, in a nerve pathway for the somatic nervous system, there's one neuron. And notice it's in the spinal cord, okay? As you look at that picture, figure 14.2, they're in that nerve cell body's in the spinal cord and goes all the way with a long axon to a muscle we can control. In the autonomic nervous system, still in the cord, you see you have a preganglionic neuron joining up with a second one called a postganglionic neuron, and then it goes to visceral muscle or, goes to glands, and you don't have any control over that. That's one physical difference. Somatic nervous system has one neuron that connects from the spinal cord to a skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system has two neurons. They'll mention the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron on 520. First couple of paragraphs, it's just basically what I said. You got to have two neurons with the autonomic nervous system. One of them is called a preganglionic neuron, where a connection is going to be made, versus a postganglionic neuron that goes from that connection to visceral muscle or to glands. So you want to read in the first column on page 520, once you get through that top couple of paragraphs, you come down to the body and to the rest of the column, and you see down at the bottom the sympathetic nervous system. You want to read that. It's going to tell you, sometimes they call it the thoracolumbar division, and you want to read that. Goes over to the next column, and you see in there it talks about getting you out of danger. You'll see that when you read that. And then your parasympathetic nervous system comes from the craniosacral division of your central nervous system. And we've already mentioned that it's the rest and digest branch of the nervous system. So when you look up at the top of page 521, you see the balance. That's homeostasis, isn't it? The balance within the body. And you and I don't have to think about it. Now, it can go wrong, but most of us, it works pretty good. Been working pretty good for me for 73 years. The actions of the parasympathetic system directly, they use the word antagonize those of the sympathetic nervous system. And we've already said they tend to be opposites. This wants to slow things down. This wants to speed it up. There's a balance. That's the way it is. Look on page 523. This should be in the handout that I sent you on page 6 and 7. And you're reading about neurotransmitters. Now, you already know about neurotransmitters. You know about norepinephrine and epinephrine and acetylcholine. I think we included dopamine and serotonin. Those are neurotransmitters. So you get a little more exposure to them. So down there at the bottom of page 523, you read about the neurotransmitters. And then you come to sympathetic receptors. Those are the receptors that pick up the norepinephrine or the epinephrine or whatever. And you see it in the second column under classes of sympathetic receptors. Those that pick up, receive norepinephrine and epinephrine, they're called adrenergic receptors because they bind to norepinephrine and epinephrine. And those that bind to ACH, acetylcholine, are called cholinergic receptors. So you get two kinds of receptors. Now it divides a little bit further. You've got alpha-1 receptors, and notice where they're located. The visceral muscle cells from different organs and blood vessels that supply the skin and the GI tract and the kidneys. And then you come to the alpha-2 receptors. They're concerned, we find most of them with the membrane of the preganglionic sympathetic neuron rather than a peripheral target gland. Remember, the two nerves have to meet, the preganglionic and the postganglionic. So alpha receptors are associated with the preganglionic neuron as opposed to a target cell like your insulin or whatever, or your pancreas. As you look on page 524, this is the last page. We got 2 minutes to cover it. Beta receptors. And you can see they're on the plasma membranes of cardiac cells. This is on 524. Come down to the bold print term, beta 1. We're not going to get into beta 1 and beta 2 and so forth, but cardiac muscle cells. Now, having said that, move over to the right, and you will see in that second column, come down to the third bullet, you'll see beta blockers. There are people who are on what they call beta blockers. So you want to read about beta blockers used in the treatment, you see, of hypertension and other cardiovascular diseases. Go back to this first column, come down to cholinergic receptors. Now, this is in your handout that I sent you. This is your game plan. This is your, what do you call it, your study guide. Those are the ones that respond to acetylcholine. You see they call them, have two divisions in there, muscarinic receptor and nicotinic receptors, because they can hook up with muscarine, which is a fungal poison that can kill you, and nicotine from cigarettes, that's a poison also that can affect those cholinergic receptors. Okay, here's the last little bit, I believe. As you look on 526, and you already know this to some degree, effects on cardiac muscle cells. Your sympathetic nervous system is going to excite them. Your parasympathetic nervous system is going to calm them down. Make your heart, if you calm it down, you don't beat as many times, you don't have as forceful of a contraction. If the sympathetic nervous system gets involved, it creates an increased rate and a harder contraction. That's how it affects cardiac cells. Look at the top of the second column. Sympathetic nervous system is going to dilate your bronchioles so you get more air in. Parasympathetic is going to close them down. Next bullet, dilation of blood vessels. You can read about that. Sympathetic and parasympathetic are opposite each other. And that is the end of the story. Do you have any questions? Are you overwhelmed? Of course, I hope you've been reading this stuff for the last couple of days, because I think I got it to you last week. If you didn't study it well, here you go. Can be cramming. I had to learn the hard way. That didn't work. Got to be able to tell the closet door. All this stuff. Do you have any questions? Yes, and it's only going to cover the eye, Ramsey. You remember we didn't get into the ear, but just what we covered with the eye. You know, the 3 layers and the components in there, like the retina and the iris and all that, and the anterior and posterior chambers. Yeah, so that's true. No, we won't. We won't meet from next week for lecture. What's going to happen next week, unless they change some things around, they're extending the seminar, the semester, another week, and so next week will be your final exam. It's the last lecture today, but the lecture exam will be next Thursday. We'll do it at the same time, 9:30, and you'll have that block of time in there to do it. I'll have 125 questions. But today is the last lecture. Everybody okay? So come Thursday, we have the 5th test, 12 through 14. And then next week, hello, Jalen. Didn't know you were there. So that's correct, Jalen. Next week, we'll do it next Thursday. That's what I said, Ramsey. My mother used to say about wishing, if wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. Okay, I'm going to end this stream here. It says, and the lecture test is this Thursday. That's right. That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. That's correct, Monica. That's correct, Sheldrick. Teresa. No, that's not Teresa. That's Rhonda. Excuse me, Rhonda. Different names from your own, so. That's what that Word document's for, Teresa. That's got the answers on it. Ramsey, I just told everybody that document I sent you is your study guide. That's right. That's right. Ramsey, you've got study guides that I've been given all year long, semester long. You got them all. Like Mallory says, you got them already. Shouldn't be lost, Ramsey. You've had 4 tests and you've got 4 study guides. That's your final exam. Good. All right, I'm going to end the stream. So I'll have it ready for you on Thursday. Well, thank you, Mallory. I appreciate that. I don't know what that means, Ramsey. Okay. I'm clicking out. I'm glad you got it, Ramsey. You're welcome, Tiffany. See you guys Thursday, 9:30. Good job. Good deal. Teach the closet door, okay? You're welcome. Sure miss seeing you guys face to face, though. I've enjoyed you.